Well, good evening, everyone. Good evening. My name is Sister Colleen Gibson. I'm on the pastoral care team here at St. John St. Paul Collaborative, and it is my pleasure to offer a warm welcome to you here in person in St. Paul's Church, and to our friends on the live stream who are watching live, but also maybe watching in the future. So thank you so much for coming out tonight, and we are sure to have a wonderful evening. Tonight, we are delighted to gather to hear Father Hehir's lecture for Lent on Pope Francis, the Church, and the world. As many of you know, it took us a while to get a date for this lecture, not by any fault of our own or because of Father Hehir's illustrious schedule that fills up pretty quickly, but because of the Pope himself. As we put together the slate of programming for this Lent, we knew that Father Bryan would be speaking to us. But the question remained, what will he speak on? Of course, there is no shortage of topics that Father Hehir can speak on, but he decided on Pope Francis. And as we have engaged the topic ever ancient, ever new this Lenten season, the question became, when should we talk about Pope Francis? You see, the Pope, or maybe God, didn't make it easy to determine the answer to that question, when. With Pope Francis's extended stay in the hospital for 5 weeks between February and March, it was hard to know when it would be best to talk about the Pope, the Church, and the world. And so just a few weeks ago, we might have imagined that this lecture could have been happening under very different circumstances. Yet by the grace of God and with the prayers of people around the world, Pope Francis has since left the hospital and is on the road to recovery. He even greeted pilgrims this past Sunday in St. Peter's Square with a joyful, happy Sunday. And so tonight, we gather, still holding Pope Francis in our prayers and eager to hear all that Father Hehir has to share with us. To introduce Father Hehir, I simply offer that, keeping with our Lenten theme, Father Hehir is a testament to the beauty of our faith, its teaching, and the invitation to encounter Jesus, our neighbors, and the political reality of our world in the context of what is ever ancient and ever new. Father Hehir is a source of wisdom, and we are blessed to share in community with him. And tonight, we are especially blessed to learn with him. Thank you for being here with us tonight, and so without further ado, I hand the mic over to Father Hehir.
Thanks, Sister Colleen. As I heard that, I think you people on the staff spent more time thinking about what I was going to talk about than I did. It is true, when the Holy Father took sick, it was a question about whether this was appropriate or how it would work. And so I had a second topic, and depending on how the month went. And maybe we'll do that next year if we're all here in gathered space. So let me tell you a little bit about what I want to do here. We are now in the 12th year of the pontificate of Pope Francis. When he was first elected to the papacy, at one point he said he thought it would be a short papacy. And no one quite knew why he said that, and I don't think he's ever explained it. But in recent years, because there has been the resignation of Pope Benedict, he would periodically be asked what he thought about the length of time. And there was no talk about a short papacy. He was already 10 years into it, and he was flourishing in it. And he, as we saw on Sunday, 2 days ago, he's flourishing today under severe illness, but showed up for the crowds, and that demonstrates his commitment to his ministry 12 years in. So we get a chance, as we pray for his recovery, full recovery, we get a chance to look at what you might call the time of Pope Francis, the time of this papacy thus far. And so I'll proceed through it in 3 steps. First, I want to talk a bit about the major influences that shape his life. Secondly, I'll talk about his impact on the church inside the church. And then thirdly, to talk about the impact of this papacy on the world as a whole. And then you'll have time for questions and comments. I guess we can't do that online, but for those who are here, we'll have time for questions and comments. So I see 3 influences that are creative forces in the life of Pope Francis. The first is that he's a Jesuit, and that whole embodiment of the tradition of the Jesuits in their preparation for final vows and living out the vocation of the priesthood within the Jesuit tradition, one can see that coming through in various ways throughout his pontificate. And so that's a first influence. Of course, he's the first Jesuit pope. So that's another significant mark in the history of Catholicism. Secondly, he's a post-Vatican II bishop. Now, Pope Francis was not at the council. The council met from 1962 through 1965, meeting always, as you'll remember, in the fall of each year. And during that time, we came to understand the significance of a council. I look out at this audience, and many of you would have similar memories to mine at the time. I was in the seminary throughout the time of the council. I entered in 1960 and was ordained in 1966. And I can tell you that the council had a profound effect immediately. It changed the curriculum of the seminary, a traditional curriculum that had been in place for a long time. As I say, Pope Francis was not at the council, but he too was shaped by it. And that has been demonstrated, as I'll indicate shortly, that has been demonstrated in his commitment to continue the legacy of the Second Vatican Council. The third influence, I think, that's particularly significant is that he's a pope from what we today call the Global South. And what is meant by the Global South is the church in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, in the Southern Hemisphere, if you will. And that, too, has a particular significance. The first pope from the Global South. A pope who grew up in independent Argentina, but a pope that lived in the Global South when the Global South was swept by decolonization during the 1960s and 70s particularly. And so we have a pope who sees the world through the eyes of the Global South. Now, we're fortunate here in our parish to have a sense of the influence of the Global South in the 3 priests from Africa who minister among us. And I'm sure you've been moved, as I have, in the way in which they celebrate the liturgy and preach, and it brings a whole different perspective on the one faith that we share with countries and churches and priests from the Global South. A Jesuit pope, a post-Vatican II bishop, and a citizen of the Global South. Each of those influences, I think, can be found in his time in the papacy. So let me turn now to his impact on the church inside, the church within the Catholic community. And a consistent theme for Pope Francis is continuing the legacy of the Second Vatican Council. Councils affect the Church by centuries, so while in the pattern of American thinking, we think of the Council as a long time ago, ending in 1965, we have to understand that we were shaped by the Council of Trent. In the 16th century, we were shaped by that council up through the mid-20th century. It was only in the 1950s, when the preparation took shape, that flourished in the council. So the council is bound to affect Catholicism, not simply for decades. We are now removed more than 50 years from its closing. But the council is bound to affect the Church far beyond our lifetime. There were 16 documents of Vatican II that captured the fruit of 4 years of reflection. The 4 key ones, I think, were first, the document on the Church itself. Secondly, the document on the Church in the modern world. Thirdly, the document on Revelation, the Word of God, the Scriptures. And fourthly, the document on the liturgy, the way we celebrate. That's the way the community of Catholicism understood the council was here. When you walked into church and the priest walked out on the altar that first day and looked at you and started the liturgy, and then as time went on, did it in English. And so that was the beginning for most Catholics, because you would get squibs on the evening news, but no in-depth treatment. And indeed, as is the Catholic tradition, we have been using those 16 documents, developing them in our theology. There is a category in Catholic theology called the development of doctrine. And what that means is our faith is rooted, first of all, in the revealed Word of God. But it also means, in the Catholic tradition, that reason and faith go together in our understanding of our faith, of God, Christ, and the Church. And therefore, the development of doctrine is the way we take the raw material of the council and develop it over time. The great teacher in Catholic life in modern times was Cardinal Newman, the English cardinal of the 19th century. And his great contribution was to say it is possible for the Church to be rooted deeply in the Word of God and the tradition of the Church, but it is possible also for us to develop that teaching in light of scholarship, prayer, and in light of responding to changes in the world to which we seek to preach and share the faith. So the documents of the council remain alive and with us. Young men trained for the priesthood today are trained through those documents, along with the development of doctrine that has occurred. And then we have had, since the council, a series of popes. And each of them have taken the faith from their predecessors, from the council, and developed it themselves in their own teaching. So if you remember these names, you can almost identify different ways in which they have impacted Catholicism. John the 23rd made the council possible, although he only was there for the first session. Secondly, Paul VI followed directly from John the 23rd. And then John Paul I was a matter of months, if you remember, and died and went to the Lord. John Paul II had an extensive papacy, and then Benedict XVI, and now Francis. So our faith is, in a sense, accumulation of the tradition itself, which begins with the scriptures, is carried forward by the teaching authority of the church, but then comes to the moment in the middle of the last century of a conciliar time. There have only been 21 councils in the history of the church, so we're a kind of privileged generation that were alive during the time that happened. So now we come to Francis and the pontificate of Francis. And as with every pope, one way of trying to summarize what is offered to us is to talk about issues of style and substance. Now, the word style may seem out of order, like this is a beauty contest, but what I mean by style is the way somebody embodies an office in the church. And to think of that list of names that I just gave you, it is obviously a pluralistic dimension as well as a dimension of continuity in the faith. Pope Francis's style is complex, and I'm sure I can't capture it totally, but I think it begins with a sense of presence. As he showed us on Sunday, he was willing, frankly, to risk his life in order to be in the midst of part of the Catholic community. And a sense of presence is one of the themes that he has developed. At times he calls it closeness to people. And he uses every occasion he can to not only speak from a distance, as he does every Sunday in the Angelus or at St. Peter's, but everything from his daily ministry in Rome to the trips he has taken throughout the world have been marked by his sense that he wanted to be in the midst of people and to do so even if there were risks to that. And we know there were risks to it, or are risks to it. In addition to presence and closeness, the Vatican is a rather awesome office. I read somebody today in preparation for this secular columnist who he disagreed with the Pope on something, but he talked about the majesty of the Vatican. Now, the way he put it was, the majesty of the Vatican couldn't cover what I think is a mistake, but that's a whole different story. So the majesty of the Vatican. So you have a Pope that stresses simplicity in an office that has carried the note of majesty from ever. Closeness, presence, simplicity. He lives, as you know, not technically in the apostolic palace. He said from the beginning he didn't think he should do that. They asked him why, and I think they were expecting he was going to give them a speech about simplicity, and he said, "I need people around me," he said. And if you have any sense of what the Vatican Palace is like, it's not a very cozy place if you're going to live there alone. And so he said, I live at Santa Marta, which is like a modern American motel, to be honest. I mean, it's nicely done, but done with simplicity. And he said, I need people around me. So then there's the question of the substance. Every pope brings a history to the office. And again, to think of the people we've heard, they're extraordinarily different sort of histories that they bring. and the history shapes the substance of the papacy. Now, Pope Francis is neither an academic by background, like Benedict, who spent his whole life in an extraordinarily productive life as a theologian and an academic. John Paul II was a philosopher before he was a theologian and brought both backgrounds to the papacy. Francis was not an academic in that sense. He had higher degrees. He taught in a secondary school. He was trained as a scientist, but productivity in writing and lecturing and teaching was not his background. Nor was he drawn from the Vatican diplomatic corps, which many of the popes of the 20th century were. Now, even the people I mentioned, Paul VI, came from the Vatican diplomatic corps. Pius XII, whom some of us remember, was drawn entirely from a life of diplomacy. His predecessor, Pius XI, the same way. Pius X, not. He had been basically a pastor and then made a bishop and then the papacy. But Francis, he was neither an academic nor a diplomat, but he has produced a papacy of substantial teaching and broad-gauged global engagement. So there are different lenses that you can use to examine him. I have to admit to you that tonight's lecture is the first step in getting me ready for another lecture in Pittsburgh in another month. And the title of that lecture is Francis, Pastor, Prophet, and Diplomat. And some of what you hear, they'll hear, but not everything that you hear is what they will hear. So we come to a person who has been a pastor. He has been an administrator of the Jesuit training of priests, and then a bishop and a cardinal, and now the Pope. So then we come to his view of the Church. I mentioned the Second Vatican Council comprised by 16 documents, but there is one theme that guides those 4 sessions of Vatican II and is embodied in those 16 documents. It was a council of the Church, about the Church. The focus of attention was the Church. Now, when you think back to the early councils of the Church and the early life of the Church, the attention was on the Trinity, on the divinity and humanity of Christ, but it took till the 20th century that the focus was on the Church in a particular way. The focus had been on the Church in the 16th century after the Protestant Reformation. The feeling within the Church was it was necessary, now that there was a different branch of Christianity with its own teaching, it was necessary to reaffirm the Catholic understanding of the Church. And so the documents of Trent did do that, but it did many other things. Whereas with the 4 sessions of Vatican II, I think it is clear that the document, the perspective was, what is this Church that we have inherited from 2,000 years of prayer, doctrine, life, and witness, and where are we today? That was the theme, and it was captured in the document on the Church itself, and then, as I'll indicate, on the Church in the world. Francis, using all of this, has given us a certain posture for the church. I've already mentioned an idea of closeness to people and also a sense of presence. And one of the most riveting images of the church that he has given us is when he told us that the church should be like a field hospital in a wounded world. He wanted a church not distant from people, but in the midst of their lives. He wanted a church of healing in a world too often divided by multiple factors: culture, language, politics, economics, war. He wanted a church that people would think of as a place they could go to take the deepest questions of their life and be helped to understand them, to live with them, to rejoice with them. A field hospital. Embodied in that idea of the church as a field hospital is accessibility, that people would feel comfortable to come to the church at any level, their parish, their ministers, their teachers. Accessibility was first, again, a sense of presence. Secondly, accessibility is openness to people coming, but involved in the church as a field hospital is active outreach, reaching out into the world, into the community of the church. And thirdly, engaging people's lives, providing consolation in sorrow, providing joy in multiple ways, providing guidance, and providing protection sometimes from various kinds of dangers. The church as a field hospital. You won't find that language anywhere in the 16 documents of Vatican II, but now it's part of the wider tradition. Secondly, he said we should be a church of encounter and accompaniment. He uses this phrase often, that what it means to do pastoral work in the life of the church is to accompany people on their journey of life. Now, accompany means being present to people. So once we go back to this notion. But accompaniment is this idea of the church should be on a journey with people as they make their journey from birth through life to the end of life. It gives an idea that the role of the church is to build bridges, not walls. And that once again, whether we're talking about our relationships with each other inside the church, our relationships to other religions, our relationship to different cultures in different places, that in every culture that the church exists, it should help to build bridges between the church and the surrounding culture and population. So, a church as a field hospital, a church of encounter and accompaniment. Next, a church of mercy. If you remember, Pope Francis declared one whole year the year of mercy, not long ago. And theme after theme was developed during the course of that year. And the idea here is, if you are to be either a field hospital that people can come to, or a church that is accompanying people on their journey, the question is, what do you bring when people encounter you or come for you to walk with them? And for Francis, he said a major characteristic is that we should be a church of mercy. He wrote one document in which he said the name of God is mercy. And so these things begin to come together. Accompaniment and encounter is to bring mercy into the life of people's lives. And he often, as he does, accompanied his teaching with mandates. So he has mandated, and I don't know how tightly this has been observed, but at one point he mandated that those who worked in the Curia in Rome, his staff, which runs through laity, priests, religious women, but also runs through the cardinals of the church, that the cardinals and the bishops and the priests were to hear confessions regularly, even though their jobs were administrative jobs. And it was precisely because their jobs were administrative and necessary that he felt it would be a good experience if regularly, weekly, they would hear confessions to all those who passed through Rome, a church of mercy. The next characteristic is that it should be a church of what he calls the peripheries of life, a church that reaches out to the edge of the circle of life. And peripheries exist at every level of a society. Peripheries exist inside the church. And so a church of the peripheries, once again, has to not only be accessible, it has to have outreach to touch the edge of the circle. And while the periphery sounds geographical, that's only one dimension of it. He calls them existential peripheries, which I think means in part that people can be on the periphery and be sitting in front of us at Mass every Sunday, but that they're distant from the church or feel distant from God, or that they're in severe material need and we don't know about it. And so, to some degree, he illustrates the geographical part of peripheries by where he chooses to go. Popes on the whole can only make so many trips, and I think John Paul II is the one that has made more than anybody else. But Francis has chosen to go to countries that are, in a sense, geographically not very accessible to the world of our time. And he chose to be present and bring the church to them. Oftentimes in cultures where the church is not the dominant reality. And to some degree, he has spent less time in cultures that are involved in the middle of the world, like our culture. He's been here once. John Paul II was, as I say, more trips and made more trips to the United States. But he came here once and had a wonderful experience for us and for him. He's gone to more than one European country, but if you looked at his list of visits, it's remarkable that they aren't necessarily in the top 10 of the IMF's counting of the world economy. So a church of the peripheries. And then finally, a synodal church. Now, what I'm doing tonight is to give you large clumps of, if you will, of Francis's ministry. And some of them require much more detail than I'm able to give you. And this is that one of them. It is clear that he is looking at his lasting legacy is in light of themes that I've talked about and he has talked about from the beginning. But in this latter part of his ministry in the chair of Peter, he has talked extensively about how we should act as a church in synod. Now, synods are ancient things in the Christian tradition. It's a coming together of designated people. And a synodal church is really introducing a way of being the church. It is not brand new. Part of the resurrection of the idea came with the Second Vatican Council. After the council, every 3 years, there have been synods of bishops throughout the world. And to some degree, an understanding of what it means to be a synodal church can draw upon the Vatican Council and the immediate holding of these synods after the council. Prior to Vatican II, each bishop in the world had a strong sense of his direct relationship to the Pope. And that's always true, named by the Pope and responsible to the Pope. But if you tried to diagram the church, it was each diocese had a direct relationship to the Pope, a strong vertical relationship. But what was lacking was bonds among the bishops themselves. Now, they would say, of course, we're part of the College of Cardinals or the College of Bishops, but what was lacking was something that brought people together. The synods were an attempt to do that. Every 3 years, there's a designated synod with a designated topic, and bishops gather. But Francis's idea is we need these ties communally among us in the way we live and work as a church. And so this topic is still in its infancy in terms of what Francis hopes for in the church. From 2021 to 2024, synods were conducted in dioceses to prepare for meetings in Rome in 2024 of what it meant to be a synodal church. And while the language may seem strange to us, think of it as a way of being the church. That in one way we can look at the church and think it's like a corporation or a company, and there are aspects that are true of that. But that's not what we are in our deepest way. It's a style of being the church in carrying out its ministry. The key words are communion, participation, and communion and participation lead to mission. And he is trying to strengthen the bonds among us. In fact, it happened with bishops. Bishops came away from Vatican II with an experience. Every bishop in the world was there who was healthy enough to be there. But they came away with an experience of having worked together to bring the church up to date to the 20th century. And that experience has been lasting since then. Each country now has a conference of bishops. I worked at our conference for 19 years. And it brings the bishops together as bishops. But Francis's goal is to move beyond bishops or priests and religious alone. And so you can have a synod of bishops, you can have a synod in a diocese, and you can think of parishes that cultivate this sense of being a synodal church. We're still in an early stage of this, and I tell you, I am only giving you the most superficial description of it. There's a style of working in a synod. It's marked, we are told, by 4 things: silence, prayer, listening to others, and then speaking your piece. And the idea is how you help that work through a church of 1.5 billion people around the world. Nothing short of that, because they were all represented, except North Korea, I think, at the Synod. in 2024. So Francis has already put in place that in 3 more years, I think 2027, there'll be a review. Now, he's 88 at the minute, so he is thinking long-term for sure. So all of that is the church within and the way he has shaped it. Before I get to the church and the world, there's a bridge issue that has to be obviously mentioned, and you know this all too well. And that is that this church of ours, Roman Catholic, from the local to the national to the global level, has been beset with a horrendous scandal, the sexual abuse scandal. And in the midst of a discussion of theology and scripture and tradition and development of doctrine and synodality, it is still there. So basically, there's the fact, which we know so well in Boston. This is where the fire was lit that spread throughout the church. That's the fact. There was the process of not dealing with it in the beginning, and then coming slowly to an awareness of how horrendous this was. And there is the consequences of the fact. 20 to 30% of people have left the church in our own archdiocese. Those who have been abused live among us with the consequences. Cardinal O'Malley, in material terms, has promised them care free of charge for as long as it takes. But we all know that you don't cure this either easily or totally. We were slow to react, but Francis put in place the Commission for the Protection of Children as the administrative arm to oversee the whole church on this issue. And he chose Cardinal O'Malley to chair that commission, which he has been doing for several years now. So that has to be included because the scandal is a bridge between the church within and the church in the world. Having looked at the church within, the consequences of the scandal are precisely those of those who have suffered, those who have left because of it, and the long, slow process of trying to find a way to invite each one who left back in an effective way, and to be sure we care for those who continue to suffer. But I see that as a bridge to now talking about the church in the world, because the effect of that scandal has made it much harder for the church to play an effective social role. When you talk about injustice and how we work to overcome it through things like Catholic charities and Catholic health care and other things, we are often reminded by those who find our ideas unconvincing because of what has occurred in our midst. That doesn't mean we should stop talking and trying to make the world a better place. Absolutely not. But there's a burden that goes with that that simply wasn't there before the scandal was made known. So now there is Francis on the church and the world. As I said, he did not come from the background that most popes come from or have come from in the last century, from the diplomatic service, so that the church in the world was their whole formation, if you will. And once again, when we look at the Second Vatican Council, If the primary document was the document on the church, the complement to that was the document called The Role of the Church in the Modern World. This was an interesting document. From the beginning of the Synod, of the 4 sessions, it was clear there was to be a document on the church, who we are, our identity. But the idea that there should be a formal document of the church about the church's relationship to the world in multiple ways was met with some skepticism. And actually, it took all 4 sessions of the council for this document to find consensus. But in its impact on the church in the world, its impact on the life of the church, it has had a lasting, powerful impact in what we do. In spite of all our weaknesses and failures, when the Pope of this church goes to the United Nations, people give it attention. And this document says that the church cannot confine itself to its internal life, that the church has a ministry and a mission to take the world as it is and to help to change it where it needs to be changed. This long document on the church in the world begins with a sense of the dignity of the human person. It moves through the role of the church to speak, to teach, to act, to produce institutions that affect the world. And then it has a chapter on political life, economic life, culture, marriage and the family, and war and peace. And it was odd for a church council to be that deeply involved in these issues. In many ways, they didn't have enough time in 4 years to do this with the kind of excellence one would like. But there's a kind of raw, informal, powerful sense of what this document tells us the church should be like. Francis has been guided by this document, and that has been for him one of the ways that he seeks to carry the church into the world. I said that when he talked about life in the church, it was about a presence. He carries that over into the kind of presence we ought to be in the world. Francis has 4 major issues that have marked his engagement with the world. The first is inequality. Inequality within societies and inequality among the nations of the world. The second is immigration. The third is the environment. And the fourth is peace and the teaching on war and peace. Once again, this is to give you a very rough overview of issues that are deep and complicated. Inequality, this is a driving force for him because he believes that radical inequality among citizens in a country or radical inequality globally is one of the major sources of conflict and suffering in the world. The logic of Catholic teaching on inequality begins with a simple statement that is affirmed in this document of the Church in the world, but it's affirmed in every document of Catholic social teaching. It begins with the sentence that says, every single person has human dignity. Theologically, it goes on to say, in the Church, every human person is made in the image of God. It goes on from that to say in the church that every human person is literally a brother or sister of Christ Jesus, because the meaning of the incarnation is that God entered the human in a human way, and he chose to identify himself with everyone that shared humanity. So we begin with the dignity of the human person. The next step is to argue that that dignity is protected by a set of rights and duties that each person has, not because they're smart, not because they're productive, not because they're of a country, a culture, an ethnic group, but because they're human. Each person has a body of moral claims that they can make in light of their dignity and the need for that dignity to be recognized. But our way in Catholic thought of talking about human rights is also to talk about human duties, that every person should live into their dignity by observing as best they can the duties they have to others, even as they claim protection and rights from others and from the society as a whole. Now, inequality is a measurement of how people stand in different ways in a society. The measurement that's usually used is material. That is to say, on basic goods of necessity to preserve human dignity, where are we in a given society? And so that takes you into the social science of talking about the numbers of people in poverty, establishing standards of poverty and wealth, and measuring levels of inequality. Are there some groups that are constantly on the edge, on the periphery? Are there some places in the society that are more touched by inequality than others? And the approach here is to not only do the immediate thing of try to provide food for the hungry and shelter for the homeless, but to look at the long-term character of a society, to ask, how is it that a substantial part, often in our country measured at about 20%, are in defined poverty? Now, poverty is a complicated notion and would take us a long discussion to talk about critiques of Catholic teaching. But we try to keep the lines clear: dignity, rights, and duties, and then try to deal with the social system where inequality is seen. If you take our own Commonwealth, I would say there are three areas: hunger, homelessness, and healthcare, and how we meet standards in each one of those. So Francis begins there. He has a strong statement that he thinks inequality can breed violence. Secondly, there's immigration. And this has been with him from the beginning of his pontificate, an abiding commitment to deal with the fact of immigration and migration in the world as a whole. He was named Pope in the spring of 2013, and the first visit he took outside the Vatican was to Lampedusa, an island off the coast of Italy, where immigrants from mainly Africa come as a kind of halfway step to get to Europe. So that was the first place he wanted the world to see him covered by the press. And he has repeated that in other settings like that. He's described his role as to be a voice for the voiceless, meaning by that that migrants and immigrants have to struggle to be heard at all, or they can't risk trying to be heard. Now, immigration is a very complicated problem. I told you earlier I had an alternate title for this speech if I wasn't going to do Pope Francis, and the title of the speech would be, "Why is Immigration So Hard?" Why is it so hard to find the right way of addressing, to build a consensus in society, to deal with all the complexity of legal immigration, illegal immigration, how we deal with questions? The Vatican is very realistic. We say theologically and morally we are a single human community. And that's where we begin with faith and reason. Every person is the image of God. And if we're all the image of God, we are all in one single community. Now, the reality of the world is that this one single community exists in about 194 sovereign states. And oftentimes the debate about immigration is about sovereignty and boundaries. The Vatican is not indifferent to sovereignty and boundaries. It is the only religious tradition in the world that has a diplomatic corps that sends the representative of the Pope into these societies to be a visible presence of him in those societies. So the debates about boundary and immigration are real. The issue is hard. We have no consensus in the country on it at the present time, in this country, but that's also true in other countries. And when he speaks for this, he speaks, as I say, as a voice of the voiceless. That is his image. Looking at the problem or the question in our own country for the church is tied to this question by history, by doctrine, and by its institutions. We are an immigrant church. That's where we came from in the United States. Secondly, our doctrine is that we are a single human family divided by states, and we need to find solutions that both protect states and protect people. And thirdly, we produce institutions to take care of people. And that's what Catholic Charities is about, and that's what St. Mary's Center for Women and Children in this diocese is about. And so a combination of history, doctrine, and institutions are the reason why this issue is important to us. And he took the extraordinary step last month of writing the American bishops saying, I know how delicate this problem is, I know how conflicted it can be, but I want to give you, in a sense, an encouragement to carry out our tradition. It was a letter unlike I have ever seen, written directly to a country about a specific question by writing to the bishops of that country. Inequality and immigration, and then there's the environment. Now, inequality and immigration have been subjects of church teaching for centuries. And Francis appeals to the traditions of those who went before him. Environment, in a sense, is an issue that has come to consciousness in the modern world only within the end of last century and this century. And Francis, while he has produced documents on these other issues that I didn't give you all the titles to, he did turn out on this issue an encyclical letter that is a remarkable piece of work. There's a woman who's a historian of science at Harvard, whose name is Oreskes, not Catholic for sure. And only by accident did I find one version of Francis's environment letter published by an English publishing house that had the introduction from this woman who said there are moments in time when a document not only is admired but leads to effective action. And she talked about Uncle Tom's Cabin and other documents like that, and said this document has that capacity. So this document, again, like synodality, goes way beyond what I can do justice to here. But his point is that as people of faith, we receive creation as a gift. The world that surrounds us comes from the hands of God. Now, the leading voices about environment are scientists, and we can't get a consensus among all scientists that the world comes from the hand of God. But it is okay for us to interpret it that way. And then the question is how we are to care for what God has given us. And that's where the environment issue takes shape among us, care for our common home. Francis, true to his teaching about inequality, entitled the letter, A Letter on Climate Change and Inequality, that it doesn't hit everybody equally or every country equally, but it is a universal question. So then the question is how we are called to care for the gift that God has given us. And this letter has had a rather remarkable history so far. It has opened a new chapter in the dialogue between Catholic faith and science, a dialogue that has not been peaceful for a good part of our life. We had a pope in the 19th century who was opposed to the railroad because he thought it was going too far technologically and violating God's issue. The next pope loved the railroad, so he put one in the Vatican City. So that's why the papacy does have a lineage that goes with it. And so the environment, along with immigration and equality, and then finally, war and peace. Again, Francis, to my knowledge, was not involved in teaching on this question when he was a bishop, although he lived through what we call the Dirty War in Argentina, which was brutal. But once he got to the Holy See, the chair of Peter, and saw the world as a whole, he again has taken this issue to part of what his teaching is about. The environment is very much an issue of our century. That's one of the positive dimensions of the encyclical. This issue is the issue that the young understand. The next generation understand this issue of environment. And they do it by instinct, and then they want to learn. And we've got a good document to share with them. War and peace have been a question in Catholic thought from the earliest days of the life of the Christian Church. And the dominant way we have thought about the morality of war and peace has come to us through St. Augustine in the 5th century, Aquinas in the 13th century, the Spanish Dominicans and Jesuits in the 16th century, and the papacy today. Francis has the experience of war, but did not have a body of teaching. He has taken a position that he states his case, and he also invites commentary on the case. When you think about the morality of war, there are 3 positions one can take. There's the position of absolute pacifism, that all taking of human life is always wrong and never legitimate. There's a counter position that is sometimes called realism, which often says war is so brutal there's no room for moral restraint, which is really not a moral position, but a corruption of the moral position. And then there's a middle position that says some uses of force are morally acceptable, but not all uses of force. And that has been the traditional position of Catholicism. Francis has done a couple of things. Whenever he talks of war, the first thing he does is to condemn it in toto. And so he always appeals to the fact that anything short of war is better than war. That's a debatable proposition. We debated it when Hitler was alive and decided, including inside the Catholic Church, that he should be opposed even by force. Francis condemns war first. Secondly, he has called into question whether this middle position of justifying some use of force but not all uses, and then specifying what's wrong. He questions whether that's capable of dealing with the technology of modern war. Now he makes that question a challenge to think about in Catholic thought, development of doctrine. For myself, I think we need the middle position as well as the condemnations of war. And so Francis has introduced the debate in the Church about what is our adequate position on war and peace. And he's pushed that to the level of nuclear weapon, where he has argued that not only is it wrong to use them, it is wrong to threaten to use them. That is not a new position. It has been held over the last 50 years in different ways and debated in detail in Catholicism. But that's another conversation that he has begun. So, he has done much more than all of that, but I'm sure you've heard enough. And so I will cease and desist and take your questions and then send you home by 8:30. Okay. Now, I understand there are a lot of people watching, or some people watching this online, so this is where we get into inequality. You're here, so you get to ask questions. So, Sister Colleen will bring a microphone so I can hear what your questions are, or your comments.
So if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand. That way the people online will be able to hear too. Oh, wow.
Well, I'll tell you, the students I taught weren't this passive.
Father, thank you for the excellent talk. At least in my observation, the world is becoming more polarized, and sometimes the Pope will make a stand one side or another. I'm not saying either side's right or wrong, but do you have any thoughts on the world becoming more polarized and the role of the Pope or the Church?
Well, the question is the war becoming more, is the polarization of the war complicating more? Well, we've got two awful wars going on at the present time, one in the Middle East and one in Central Europe, and that was the subject of my lecture last year. Those are brutal wars, and the technology is clear. Drones are different than anything we've ever had before. However, of course, the wars of the 20th century, World War I and World War II, were much large-scale wars. The Pope himself, as I say, is going to always begin, large-scale or small, to condemn war as a human mistake. And then he realizes you've got to get beyond this. While the world does have a lot of polarization in it, we also have a lot of interdependence in the world. We are closer to each other through technology and communication and travel than any other generation in the history of mankind. My sense is that if you take the two wars that we have, there are specific causes that go beyond simply polarization. There are specific different kinds of causes. Those are two different kinds of war. One is an open aggression across a recognized international boundary, and that is Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The war in the Middle East began with an attack across a recognized boundary and large-scale taking of human life in an inhuman way by Hamas on Israel. If you take the middle position, which is the one I use most of the time, it is that attack was unjust and therefore gave Israel the right to respond, as Russia's invasion gave Ukraine the right to respond, and it also gives other nations in the world the ability to help out one side or the other. Once you get into the war, then you start judging not only why it started, but how it's fought. So you can argue that the Ukrainians have the right to respond, but we'll also watch and see how they fight the war. You can argue Israel has the right to respond, but we'll watch, and there has been a fair amount of criticism about how they respond. And the Pope has come under some criticism in both of those cases from Israel and Ukraine, that by condemning war as a whole, he didn't distinguish how it started, who was responsible, and how it's being fought. And so there is a way in which the position you take about the morality of war leads to sub-questions, and that's why I think Catholic thought today stands, there's a body in the church that clearly are in the school of nonviolence in a way that wasn't the case in most of the 20th century. There's a large body of Catholics and scholars. But I think with the kinds of wars that we see in the Middle East and in Central Europe, to my mind, that middle position that says there are some uses of force that are morally acceptable, including self-defense, is the more adequate position. So I don't think it's only about polarization. It is about other issues that feed into that. Gentlemen, we'll keep you running.
Thank you for that. Actually, I want to follow up to the previous question. And I think it's an unfair question to you. No, I'm thinking if I want to ask, because it's a little bit unfair, but polarization, I feel, especially after chatting, having conversation with practicing Catholic, I have seen several popes too, not as many as you, but almost. I heard practicing Catholics saying, oh, no, this is not my pope. So the unfair question is, what do you see for the Catholic Church after Pope Francis?
I missed the first part of your question, I'm sorry.
The first part is that I have met several practicing Catholics, like all of us, stating publicly, this is not my pope, which is, to me,
oh, this is not my pope. Oh, okay.
So polarization, that's what I forgot.
Yeah.
There is also polarization inside the church, right?
Yeah. Well, of course, Catholic teaching admits of levels. Catholic teaching admits of levels. And so there are different levels in a sense that the teachers in the church, namely the Holy Father and the College of Bishops, take. And there is room on some things for open debate. As I say, the Pope has taken quite definite stands on war and peace, but he has on a couple of occasions said, that's my basic position. There is room for discussion on this. So I think there is the question of someone who says, I deny the divinity of Christ and I'm a practicing Roman Catholic is in trouble. Okay, it's the best way I can put it, because if you deny the divinity of Christ, then why are you receiving the Eucharist? For example, and how that would go. So if someone says that, I think they're in big trouble. When you get down to statements that are the teaching of the Pope, but are open to public debate, then it is legitimate to exercise that. I'd have to go through a whole series of examples to illustrate what I mean by I think as Catholics we have a presumptive sense that we are bound to listen to the teaching church. Depending on the level of the statement and how it addresses an issue, there may be time for space for debate, but we'd have to go case by case to make sense of.
Just 1 second, so just want to follow up.
Why don't I just come up close to you, because the microphone is echoing all over. Yes. Yes, sir. I'll repeat the question. No, the mic is not helping me.
Oh.
Would you like me to speak? Okay. The concept of the church as a hospital, a field hospital in war for the wounded and the sick was such a beautiful concept when he spoke of that or introduced that. I remember it being talked about in terms of maybe divorce or maybe abortion or maybe same-sex matters and things like that. Has that been widely embraced within the church community?
The field hospital model?
Field hospital concept.
Yeah, I think on the whole, the question here is, has the church's teaching on a number of issues, including abortion and divorce, whether the field hospital model works for that. I think, first of all, the field model hospital, it says the church should be open to people's needs, it should listen to them, it should reach out to them, and then try and see what questions they have in life. Now, when you take some of the issues that you talked about, the question on abortion in Catholic teaching is very strongly held as teaching. I've talked about levels of authority, directly intended, purposeful taking of fetal life is wrong. And that is Catholic teaching, and there is not exceptions to that rule as stated. There are complicated medical questions that can come up. But that's it. Now, that's the moral position. That's the religious position. The question of translating that position into civil law is then a more complicated question. In other words, you can hold the position that the directly intended taking of human life is always wrong. And you might well debate about whether you should try to install that in civil law or not. Now, the church has always tried to install it in civil law, but there are debates in the church about that. There's no question about the civil law part. So that's a good example. You mentioned divorce. There's been changes in canon law that try to make it possible for divorced and remarried people to find a way through annulment and other ways to be in the church. So you have to go case by case to understand this. And are there divisions in the church as well as the society? Sure, there are. But we have procedures, I think, to handle those kinds of debate. Theologians have the right as professional teachers in the church to test the waters on various things, to try to explain them to the wider public, or to try and bring about change. But that may take a long time and it may not succeed.
I wasn't thinking of the field hospital as one changing the church's rules, but one of forgiveness and welcoming someone who...
Right. Well, as I said, the meaning of the field hospital is welcome everybody. But when you get into discussions about issues, you at least have to engage the discussion. But the meaning of the field hospital is, as I say, on the one hand, accessibility, and on the other hand, an outreach, more than just waiting and welcoming, but to reach out to people and make available to them places where their life can be enhanced by the work of the church. I can see an audience running out of energy. I've been at this for a long time. I can spot it from miles away. So you have 3 more minutes. Yes, just ask me and then I'll... Sure.
Father, thank you so much. One reads a lot about politics within the Vatican. I would look at the Francis papacy and say it's been remarkably successful. He is loved by billions around the earth, and yet there is this sense that there's large factions in the Vatican that disagree with Francis' mission and purpose. Obviously, we can't predict what happens in the future, but is that stuff kind of true, or is there more uniformity of opinion within the Vatican, and where do some of these stories,
So the question is, for those at home, we hear about lots of debates within the Vatican itself, and parties and factions that don't agree necessarily with what Francis has done or said. Does that exist? Inside the Vatican, there's more pluralism than people would think. But it has to do with the nature of the issue, the level at which it's held, and the reason being proposed to take an alternative position. So I would say that Francis has exercised very strong leadership. I'd say he has widespread support in the church as a whole as the voice and faith of Catholicism. Is there agreement on all things that I've talked about? Agreement on immigration, agreement on war and peace? No, either inside or outside you will find debate about that, and particularly in the theological community, there is both an understanding that we should analyze teaching, enhance it, try to communicate it, and at times differ with it. And there's rules and ability to do that. So, sure, I wouldn't say the Vatican operates like a democracy. That would be to go too far. But there are different views within the Curial staff that surrounds the Pope. I think you have put up with enough for Lent. I'll talk to you. I'll see you later.
Well, thank you, Father Hehir, and thank you all for coming out tonight. And we